Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. We've got a guest who you may have heard before. He's returned to do a follow-up on the successful podcast we did way back in the start of 2019 around operational excellence. Delighted to welcome you back. It's Odie Penn. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's good to hear you, Simon, and thank you for inviting me back. I appreciate it very much.
No, it was a great reaction to the first podcast. We talked a lot after it and had a lot of follow-up in terms of all the points you raised around, following the process. Did it produce the intended results and all those other bits around operational excellence that you shared your knowledge with. So today, I think we're going to move the conversation on slightly in terms of that theme and explore it a little bit deeper. But if maybe people haven't listened to the first one that you took part in, you're the managing partner at Faro Partners. Do you want to give us a bit of background again on what you do and how you've got to being in that position today?
Certainly. I guess it starts with the operational excellence execution in a few corporate settings, large corporate settings, and out of that experience, certification in the lean practitioner space at all three levels, the bronze tactical level, the silver integrative level, and the gold strategic level. And I think that's really what brought me here to where I am today. It was those experiences that allow me to actually help others avoid some of the mistakes that I made and see what operational excellence is really all about. And we're focused at the leadership level, trying to get that leadership engagement and influence in place, because I think that's really the key to successful operational excellence in whatever industry it is you're practicing.
Brilliant. Yeah, so we both share a passion for a process and looking at opportunities to refine those processes, maybe automate them, maybe make them less reliant on humans, or being able to do more with the same people. So we're cut from the same mold, let's say.
I believe so.
Good. So let's dig a little bit deeper then into this whole operational excellence piece that we discussed in the first podcast. And let's look at kind of creating value. So kind of if I'm in an organization, I suppose reflecting on what value do I create and how do I create that? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And the first idea that strikes me as we start to explore this is we often don't even see the processes around us until the value that we expect to be created isn't, right? So there's a gap somewhere that we're trying to understand. And quite frankly, that's what leadership exists for. I think a major part of it is holding organizations in focus on those expected outcomes, as we talked about in our previous conversation. And I think that's where we get into trouble, because leaders respond to gaps in performance by diving into the how of the work, where I think most employees are simply looking to understand better, what does the outcome look like? If I'm clear about that, I can be much more clear about whether or not the method that I'm using to produce it is actually effective. And so I think that's one of the biggest gaps that I try to help leaders focus on, is who's actually communicating what's important to the organization if you are not.
And should that be top down, or should that be bottom up, or a mixture of both?
It's a mixture of both, because there has to be some negotiation around what that means. So if you're my manager and you come to me and you express your desires for a certain outcome, we first need to check for understanding, right? And so I'm going to respond back to you what I think it is you're asking for, so that you can validate with me, yes, you understand what I'm asking for, or no, Audie, that's not what I was talking about. Let's go a little bit deeper, right? So the conversation there is critical, and that's often what's missing. We just don't spend enough time in conversation with our teams to ensure we're all on the same page.
And is it a time thing? Are people too busy to spend time with those conversations? Is it just they don't understand the importance of it at the start and then kind of pay the pay the price for it almost near the end, or when the deliverables revealed? What's in your mind around why that potentially doesn't happen?
I do believe it's a time issue, although I think it's a misunderstanding of time. I've recently shared with my clients a quote that just resonates for me, and it really connects to our conversation here. It's if you don't think you have time to do it right, what makes you think you have time to do it over? And I think when we start to recognize that that's what's going on in our hurried and busy lives, we're spending a great amount of time recovering from not spending the right amount of time initially to simply establish correct expectations and agreements about what the outcomes should look like. And that, again, is a primary function of leadership.
Yeah, so we talked a lot in the first podcast about outcomes. Let's just move on a little bit to objectives and defining the process. So if we've got a clear brief, it's been agreed, we're aligned, how do you kind of set then those objectives and define the process that you may be studying, or you may be reviewing, or creating even?
So one of the key tools that we use to help leaders engage in these conversations, there's many names for them. In some organizations, they're called metric boards, and some they're called visual management boards, and some they're called accountability cycles. But for me, it's a real simple conversation. There's actually two questions that I try to encourage leaders to ask very frequently and regularly. And those two questions are, did you follow your method? Or in the more mature, lean organizations, did you follow your standard work? And the second question is, did you produce the intended results? And so the more frequently we have these conversations, it actually allows us to evaluate the efficiency of the methods that we're using. But without those conversations, I may be out doing my job thinking I'm doing well when, again, I'll put you in my manager's role where you're sitting at your desk looking at reports and wondering what it is that we're doing because it's not producing the results that you intended, but yet the conversation is missing. And so we never really get to the root cause of the breakdown and respond to it or address it, number one, appropriately, and number two, as quickly as possible.
So we know what we're doing. We know it's been agreed. And we talked a lot again around leadership, and we'll kind of come back to it now. There's a real importance, is there, in terms of the leadership in defining that outcome. But do you also think it's important that they're open to feedback as well for people that are in the detail of that process? Because a process on a Visio or an online process map is fine. It's two-dimensional. The people that are working that process or exploring it or re-engineering it, they're the ones that see all the nuances that are really difficult to capture in any type of map. So should that definition piece be two-way?
Absolutely. And that's where the negotiation process comes into play, because in one podcast I've recently done, I talked about the dangers of expertise. If a leader shows up with the expertise and the answers immediately, the team simply stops thinking and participating. But when a leader shows up and uses an approach that I've picked up over my years called advocacy and inquiry, there's actually an invitation into the conversation to discuss methods to produce the outcome. And a lot of learning actually takes place in those kinds of conversations. And it is indeed back and forth. It's not always one directional.
And outcomes can be defined in different ways. So there could be a process change, there could be a new map involved. How do you break those outputs down in terms of their different KPIs that support the delivery of it, or are the outputs really tangible physical things? How does that work?
Well, in many of the visual management boards, I'll just use that term for now, we often see 4 common categories: safety or risk, quality, timing, delivery, lead time, is the third, and then the fourth is typically productivity. Sometimes they'll add cost, although I suggest you don't go that deeply. I think productivity is a better measure that is more accessible to teams. If you can measure it right, they don't always see the connection between productivity and cost, and sometimes it's convoluted. But those conversations and those measures or KPIs have to be meaningful to the team so that they can understand how their work and how changes in their work can actually impact those categories. And there are additional categories that others add, but I think those were the original four and core from the Toyota production system, where most of this stuff grew from.
And should those be reviewed on an ongoing basis once they've been defined? Will they ever change in terms of the work you see through the duration of a project, or what's agreed at the start is always the outcome at the end?
I would say yes and yes. They should be reviewed frequently, and yes, they will change as we learn more about the process that we're engaged in, and quite frankly, as the marketplace changes their expectations and demands and how they define value, our measures have to change right along with them. So, but these measures are the evidence that I think you mentioned earlier that we're seeking when we're in these conversations. What evidence do we use to identify value? We have to have some measure that makes sense to people, and that's always the point of evidence that I'm encouraging leaders to seek out.
And how do people manage the change? Because it's easy to define something at the start, kind of travel in hope that it's being delivered, or there's update reports that say we're on track. But if, as you mentioned there, the market changes or requirement changes, or actually once you start to understand the defined process, it's not as you thought. How do people manage those changes, or do some people not manage the change and then get surprised at the end?
Yes, that happens quite frequently, and that is when they're not paying attention. There are three learning loops that we often see in organizational development material. The first two are actually represented in the first two questions. Did you follow your method? Did you produce the intended results? The third one is, are we actually looking for the right results? And that's where we kind of turn our gaze outward into the marketplace and the environment to say, or to ask the question, has the definition of value with regard to our customers changed, and are we changing with it? That may not necessarily be as frequent a conversation, maybe quarterly, certainly more than once a year. Now at the executive level, we often see these in strategic sessions, and 5 years is often a duration, but I actually think you should be looking at that more maybe every other year or every 3 years at the executive level.
And sometimes that must be difficult to gauge, because the market, if you're at the cutting edge of your market, you may almost be forging the direction, so you're not in control. But certainly if you're following a trend, it's a lot easier to see what's happening in front of you and maybe predict which way it's going to go or future trends. But if you're actually leading, that must be a more difficult place to be, because you've got to set the tone.
Exactly. And this is where I think innovation has its home. And another reason why I think a more frequent conversation is imperative, because when we see on the horizon opportunities, that's when the innovation muscle should kick in, and we begin to explore different ways of satisfying the desire in the marketplace. And if we're out in front far enough, we may actually be able to command a significant portion of market share in that new desire in the marketplace. So I don't think 5 years is the right frequency. I think 2 or 3 makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I'd agree. And maybe in an environment as we currently record today that's changing around us with lots of things outside of our control, maybe even shorter. But that innovation piece is interesting. Do you see lots of organisations that are stifled or can't innovate because of the fear of failure?
Yes, I think that's one of the barriers or hurdles that we see. The other one is simply just not paying attention. It's not asking that third question: are we delivering the right value? Is our value target shifting, and do we recognize the shift? So those two things absolutely get in the way of actually innovation and continuing to deliver the value that our customers seek.
Yeah, the world's changed, hasn't it? Massively. And even if you think the last 5 years, the biggest taxi company, Uber, doesn't own any taxis. The biggest hotel company, Airbnb, doesn't own any hotels. And there's other examples clearly. But that if we'd have been recording this 10 years ago, we'd have been one way ahead of our time in terms of podcast and probably millionaires. But two, we'd have probably never figured that you can have a really successful company without any physical assets, but still deliver services through physical things, Airbnb, people's houses, and Uber, people's cars. It probably would have blown our minds.
Yes, very much.
So that, casting our minds 10 years forward then, how do companies push the boundaries, innovate, create, be right on the cutting edge of their industry if we couldn't kind of think about where we are today 10 years ago? What's that evolution path like?
I think it goes back to people. And I saw an odd headline recently about artificial intelligence not being artificial or intelligent. That one struck me. But I think the point that was being made was all of the algorithms that we see within the statistical analysis taking place in artificial intelligence are coming from the intelligence of an individual who sees something and tries to capture it mathematically. And my point here is simply relationships and being open and listening to people, being in conversation and willing to explore what's on the horizons. I think if we lose that, which technology challenges us to rely more and more on, a quote my wife put up, outsourcing our thinking. We've got to hold on to it. We've got to collaborate with technology rather than submitting to technology. And I think that's a challenge for us right now because technology makes a lot of things really easy. And the easier it gets, the further away we get from thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole agile way of working and kind of failing quickly, which I quite like the idea of, rather than it being a 6, 12, 18-month project process to learn it was probably never going to work in the first place. That whole way of working, how does that lend itself to kind of the whole piece we've talked about at the start of this conversation in terms of defining the process, defining the outcomes, when actually in an agile world, sometimes it's a concept or it's a theory rather than a really defined outcome?
I think it fits perfectly. One of our team members actually just went through Agile training, and when she came back, her comment was, conceptually, it's exactly the same thing that we've been talking about. The language has changed a little bit, but the iteration of the cycles of thinking seem to be a little bit quicker. And if we go back to the 3 learning questions, the 3 learning loops, are you following your process? Is it producing the intended results? And are we still working on the right things? We hear and feel those same thoughts in the agile space. It's just, it feels like we're trying to repeat those 3 questions at a higher frequency so that we can move things forward, maybe in smaller steps, but more quickly. And there's where I think fail quickly shows up. If it doesn't work, okay, move on and figure out what didn't work and correct it. And I think that's exactly what lean and operational excellence has tried to create over the years. It's a very common thinking, and I see it showing up in the agile world as well.
So it's just a kind of evolution of that practice into a way of, I suppose, shortening the cycle lengths and the iterations of thinking.
Exactly, because it's those closed loop cycles that allow us to evaluate whether or not what we're doing is effective.
Excellent. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It all comes back to the same three questions, as you say. Even if you apply a new name to it, or a longer cycle, a shorter cycle, we get back to the same three fundamental questions every time. So, if we were sat here in 10 years' time, then where do you think the world will be from a process excellence, operational excellence point of view? Will it have moved even into smaller cycles with kind of agile extreme, or can you see it going backwards, or just somewhere completely differently?
I think it would be where it is being implemented successfully. I think you'll see shorter and shorter cycles, quicker and quicker cycles. My concern is, and goes back to where we started with the whole leadership piece. The greatest failure that I see in implementing lean or operational excellence is missing the leadership space. And what I often tell people is when potential clients tell me that they know lean, my radar goes off, because what most people mean when they say that is, I've practiced process improvement techniques. And process improvement techniques are only about 20% of the total picture when it comes to operational excellence. The rest of it is the strategic piece, being able to define what's important, the management piece, which is these iterative cycles of asking and learning in those three loops, and the leadership piece, which invites people in to participate in these communities that actually flourish when you get all four pieces together. And those quicker cycles don't seem so intrusive. They're expected, and we're all part of it. And that's where the greatest learning takes place, when everyone in an organization is connected and committed to the same mission, and everyone is able to participate and provide value in their own way, but still all pointed at the same target.
So there's a danger it becomes almost too agile, or the agile kind of extreme example that they talked about, and that misses the leadership loop. And then I assume then things would slow down and kind of almost come back to where we are today.
Yes. It what it does, without that leadership guiding us down the same path, we all find our own paths, and our organizations become fragmented, and we actually lose the power of the people, because an individual has much less power than an organization does. And that's where the whole alignment piece comes into play. And that takes us right back to the leader's responsibility is defining what's important and holding our attention on the right outcomes.
Fascinating. I think it kind of brings us to a natural close at that point, in terms of another great conversation on operational excellence, another great set of learnings from yourself, but brings us back to those fundamental three questions. So do you want to leave the listeners with those three questions as a reminder before we close?
Certainly, that would be a great place to land. First question, are you following your method, or in a more mature organization that's practicing operational excellence, are you following your standard work? The second question, did it produce the intended results? And the third question is, are we still creating value with the results we have chosen?
Perfect. That's a great three questions for anybody listening who's in our world to keep asking themselves. Once again, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. I really enjoyed our first chat, and this one as well. So it'd be good to keep in touch. We'll put your contact details on the footnotes again, so if anybody wants to reach out, they can contact you. Really appreciate your time. Great to catch up again.
You as well, Simon. You have a wonderful day. Thank you.